On the evening of November the 22nd, 1987, a live television broadcast in Chicago was suddenly taken over. Not by the station, not by an error, but by someone no one has ever been able to identify. Viewers watched as the signal cut out without warning, replaced by a figure wearing a distorted mask, moving in front of a strange, shifting background, speaking in a voice that didn't quite sound human. There was no explanation, no message, and no follow-up. And even now, decades later, no one knows who was behind it, or how they managed to do it. The first hijacking took place during a sports broadcast on a local Chicago station, where the signal was suddenly overridden without warning, cutting directly into the live program. At first, it appeared to be a standard disruption, the kind of brief signal loss that might happen for technical reasons, but that assumption only lasted a few seconds. When the image returned, the masked figure appeared, partially lit and framed awkwardly, standing in front of a moving background that was clearly designed to resemble the digital effect associated with Max Headroom, a fictional TV character from the 1980s, created to look like a computer-generated host, known for his stiffer movements, glitchy speech, and an artificial presence that never quite felt human. Though the imitation here was noticeably rougher, which only made it feel more unsettling. There was audio, but it was heavily distorted, with buzzing and interference making it difficult to understand anything clearly, while the figure's movements were exaggerated and irregular, giving the impression that whoever was behind the mask was intentionally trying to replicate something they didn't fully understand. The interruption lasted around 20 seconds before the station regained control of the broadcast. For most viewers, it felt strange but not necessarily alarming, something that could be dismissed as an odd glitch or technical error. For the people running the station, however, it was immediately clear that something far more serious had happened. What made the incident particularly unusual wasn't just the content of the interruption, but the fact that it had happened at all. Because overriding a live television signal in the 1980s required a level of access and technical capability that wasn't easily available. This wasn't someone interfering with a home television or manipulating a local feed. This was someone transmitting a signal strong enough to override the station itself, even if only briefly, which meant they had both the equipment and the knowledge to carry it out. And for those few seconds, whoever was responsible had complete control over what thousands of people were seeing. Inside the station, that realisation came quickly. What might have initially looked like a routine fault didn't behave like one, and within moments it became clear that the signal hadn't failed and it had been taken over. Engineers worked to secure the broadcast and check their systems, but there was no obvious internal cause, which only reinforced the idea that the source had come from outside. Before there was time to fully understand how it had been done, the situation would escalate again, this time on a different station. Later that same night, the interruption happened again, this time on a different station, and unlike the first incident, it lasted significantly longer, allowing more of the broadcast to play out. The signal cut in without warning, replacing the programme with the same masked figure, now more clearly visible, positioned in front of the same shifting background that created an almost hypnotic effect as it moved behind him. This time, the figure spoke more, and while the words were still distorted, certain phrases came through clearly enough to stand out. At one point, he appeared to mock a television presenter, saying, "I still see the X," in what sounded like a direct reference, though the context wasn't explained. Moments later, he held up what looked like a can, making a brief comment about Coke, before shifting again without any clear connection, as though each part of the broadcast was moving in a different direction. As it continued, the tone became increasingly strange. The figure's movements grew more exaggerated, the pacing more erratic, and the structure, if there ever was one, began to fall apart, turning what might have been interpreted as parody into something far more chaotic. Toward the end, the broadcast took another unexpected turn, with a brief sequence that felt deliberately bizarre pushing the interruption further away from anything that could be easily explained or understood. Eventually, the hijacked signal cut out as abruptly as it had begun, and the station regained control, returning viewers to normal programming without any immediate explanation. For those watching, the moment passed quickly, but the confusion it created lingered, because there was no context for what had just happened and no clear way to interpret it. For the stations involved, however, the situation was far more serious, because what they had experienced wasn't a technical fault or an internal error, it was an external intrusion. In the hours that followed, both stations began reviewing what had happened, with engineers analysing the signal in an attempt to determine how it had been overridden and where it might have originated. At the same time, reports from viewers began to come in, with people calling the stations to ask what they had just seen, some assuming it had been part of the programme, whilst others recognised that something unusual had taken place. Authorities were notified and an investigation was launched, focusing not only on identifying who was responsible, but also on understanding how such an intrusion had been possible. But despite these efforts, no clear source was ever identified, and no one was arrested in connection with the incident. Over time, several explanations have been suggested, most of which centre around the idea that the hijacking was carried out by someone with a strong understanding of broadcast systems, combined with access to equipment capable of transmitting a powerful signal. Some believe it was intended as a form of satire or commentary, referencing the artificial nature of television and the character of Max Headroom itself, while others see it as an act of disruption, designed not to communicate a specific message, but simply to interrupt and confuse. What makes it difficult to define is the absence of any clear objective, because unlike most intrusions of this kind, there was no demand, no explanation, and no attempt to follow up. Instead, it appears as a moment that begins without warning, unfolds in a way that feels increasingly strange, and then ends just as suddenly, without resolution. Most broadcast interruptions are quickly explained and forgotten, resolved through technical fixes or identified as simple errors, but this one remains different because it was never fully understood. The footage still exists and has been analysed repeatedly, yet it hasn't led to any definitive answers about who was responsible or how they managed to carry it out. What remains is a moment that briefly interrupted something familiar, replacing it with something that didn't quite follow the same rules, and in doing so, created a sense of confusion that hasn't completely faded. Because even now, looking back at those few minutes of distorted footage, it still feels unclear whether what people witnessed was intended to mean something, or whether it was simply designed to disrupt. And that uncertainty is what keeps the incident from being fully resolved. If you enjoy stories like this, the ones that leave more questions than answers, then make sure you're subscribed, because there are more of them, and some are even harder to explain.